I'm talking about conspiracies and the paradox of populism. And I'm going to begin with just reviewing my thoughts about conspiracies. And I'm going to look at things from the point of view of systems thinking. And then I'm going to use some of those lessons to look at populism, populist parties, and the paradoxes inherent in that. And then finally, look towards some solutions or useful things one might learn from it. Now, to do this, I'm going to have to repeat quite a lot of things I've already said, and I actually hate repeating, but it's inevitable. If you're a fairly unknown author, you can't just say, as you all know from my previous book, blah, blah, blah. You have to sort of introduce your ideas again and again. And so there's going to be quite a lot of repetition of previous talks I've given. And in fact, most of those talks have been written up in this book, Post-Truth Politics and Magical Thinking, as transcripts. And so the material is there, and in the notes I'm going to put references to the original talks and to this book. Another book that I'll be addressing is my book, The Little Book of Demons, because that provides some of the theory for what I'm saying. But anyway, to get back to conspiracies. Now, I chose an example. There's a lot of things wrong in the world that look pretty evil. And the example I chose was iatrogenic sickness. If you look up statistics for the amount of illness that is actually caused by the medical profession and big pharma, the remedies that are provided, it's actually quite shocking. It's the sort of thing that people would want to try to cover up. And so it's very easy to, it really looks as though there's a conspiracy here of pharmaceutical companies creating drugs that will make people ill so that they can go on selling more drugs and get them hooked, make a huge fortune. It really looks like a conspiracy. But I'm a bit skeptical about conspiracies. And I think that very often it's something in the system. You see, the trouble with the conspiracy in the traditional sense of the word is it naturally makes you want to start a forensic investigation to find who's behind the conspiracy so you can take action. Now, in the case of the medical profession, I don't think there's any significant number of people behind that conspiracy. Of course, I'm not saying there's never been a doctor that doesn't want to swindle people and make money. Particularly in the early history of medicine, before it's formalised, you've got these snake oil salesmen, people like that, definitely creating fake news and in order to sell people their dud remedies. So it happens, but all the medical people I've ever met and the people working on cures actually do want to heal people. Now, okay, some of them may actually have chosen medicine because it does make a lot of money, but if that was their only intention, then surely it's better to go to something like financial services or market trading rather than something which means all those years of education before you can do it. So I find it very hard to believe that there's a serious cabal of evil people making this happen, this iatrogenic sickness. Now, the other doubt that I have is that I cannot believe, even if there were these evil people, I cannot believe that humans are that competent to be able to organize a worldwide movement in secrecy. You see, humans have created amazing things, road system, railway system, the internet, capitalism, all sorts of amazing things have been created by humans, but they've been done transparently. which means that everyone is aware when things go wrong and it adjusts and keeps alive. Now, as soon as humans start doing things in secrecy, the cock-ups begin to happen. If you think of, the war in Iraq and all this search for weapons of mass destruction, complete cock-up of the intelligence services, and the sort of confusion between them and the rival services and the journalists who want a good story. Think of a really well-organised conspiracy, the Nazi Party. Brilliant organisation, very everything, but the whole thing sort of cracked up eventually. And so I just find it very difficult to believe in a mastermind of super experts manipulating the world to make things happen, which is ironical. Of course, the last book I've published, the Hellgate Chronicles, is exactly about that, but it's a satire. So I begin from being skeptical about the idea of a conspiracy behind this. Now, this is interesting because this is the point where the way diverges. The trouble with my disbelief is that many people, and I think probably the majority of people, would say, oh, well, it isn't actually a conspiracy, it's just the way things are, and they don't do anything about it. It's just the way things are. Another smaller group say, wow, that proves it's a conspiracy. The fact you can't identify who's behind it means it's a cover-up. It's probably part of the whole intelligence thing, covering up the evil people. And then you've got, the traditional conspiracy theory. Now, I don't think either of those approaches are ideal. And so I look for something in between. And what I look for is how the system can encourage this sort of misbehavior. What goes wrong? Now, I'm going to describe that the model I took was imagining 3 companies. This is just a thought experiment. Imagine 3 companies, A, B, and C, all working to produce a cure for arthritis. Company A develops a superb remedy, which under the strictest laboratory conditions and double-blind tests gets remarkable results for curing arthritis. Unfortunately, when it's outside those strict control conditions in the open market, it doesn't do very well in everyday life, and people find the results disappointing. The second company, B, finds a cure for arthritis. Okay, you have to take it for about 4 months. But at the end of that 4 months, your fingers have straightened out, your joints are restored, you're a strapping young man again. Wonderful. The third company creates something which immediately begins to ease the symptoms, pretty helpful, but some people suffer some side effects. Some people get stomach aches, some people get skin rashes, some people get headaches. Not very many of them, but there are these side effects. And the question is, if you were an investor, which of these 3 companies would you invest in? And I'm going to propose 3 sort of graphs of their sales. Look at A. It gets off to a hell of an advantage. Why? Because there's been so much good publicity about those results in the laboratory. Really impressive in a scientific point of view, really impressive results. The trouble is, it doesn't work very well without control conditions in everyday life. And the fact that it was so much talked about means that when it starts to fail, it gets into the news very quickly. It didn't work for me, that sort of thing. And so the sales go from high and they plunge down once word gets around that this stuff doesn't actually work in real life. The second company struggles a bit at the beginning, B, because you've got to take it for 4 months before you're really convinced it's good. But after the 4 months, word gets around, it really works. And so you see it goes steeply up when people start, word of mouth. This stuff is miraculous, brilliant. Now you might say, why doesn't it keep going up? Why does it begin to dip down? The answer is, and this is the paradox of the healing profession, a patient cured is a customer lost. When I've got my 4 months worth and I've got rid of all my arthritis and I'm a strapping young man again, I'm not going to go on taking this stuff. That's the end of it. Goodbye. I'm delighted. I love the company, but I'm not going to go buying their things. Whereas C, people notice it really does make some sort of difference. After a week or two, I feel it's easing the symptoms. And okay, some people get headaches, but the same company sells headache tablets. Some people get skin rashes, but the same company sells skin lotion. Some people get stomach upsets, but the same company sells, gastric stuff. So they keep selling more and more. Now, so that shows the sort of evolution favours company C. And it's actually what reinforces that is that company C will, in the longer run, make more money because of its wide selling all these other things. And making more money means they've got more money than A and B to spend on further research. And they've got more money than A and B to spend on promotion. So that's the sort of company to invest in, because it'll go up and up and up and up. Now, what I've presented to you is just a thought experiment to show the way the wind blows. I've not proven anything in the sort of scientific sense, because I don't think you'll find any companies only based on one product like that. All 3 companies would probably have a huge portfolio of medicines. And so my example, you could say, is unrealistic. But it points to something. And that's what I want to talk about. You see, you could say that I've pointed out the prevailing wind, the way the evolution goes in the medical profession. Prevailing wind. If you're an experienced camper and you're about to set up your tent in a new place, one of the things you look for is signs of a prevailing wind. The trees leaning a certain way, the sand blowing at a certain path, things like that. Because it makes some sense to place your tent so the entrance is downwind. Now, the skeptic would laugh at that. He says, the wind is blowing over the place, you can't predict a wind like that, never like that. You should look and see what's exactly happening now, where the wind is. And the experienced camper knows that. He takes all those things to account, but also just looks out for signs of a prevailing wind, because that's useful to help his decision. An understanding of the wind does tend to blow that way. So I'm sort of showing you that I'm not proving anything about one company. I'm saying that in the healing professions, and that includes the pharmaceutical industries, there is a wind which tends to evolve them towards making a lot of money by producing pills and potions which help an illness but don't remove it. That's the way things tend to go, and that's what we're suffering from. Now, interestingly, I read I was reading, my wife is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and this is their magazine, and it had a very interesting article by a James Wilson, Professor of Philosophy at UCL, whatever that is, called The Intervening State, about sort of political decisions and things and the need for a new way of looking at them. And one of the things he says is that the mental model of causation that politicians and citizens alike tend to start from is akin to something like a billiards table. Everything is static until a force is applied to the cue ball, which then strikes another ball and causes it to sink into the pocket. In such a world, causes are easy to identify and responsibility is easy to parcel out. In reality, social systems, institutions, biological systems behave very differently. And he points out that being stable and not changing is not a question of laziness and everything like that. It actually takes a lot of energy. And I know that from being brought up in the deep country. You know, people would come from town and look around my parish and say, God, this place hasn't changed in 500 years. What a load of old stick in the muds, you know, sitting around just doing what they've always done. No imagination. What they forget or don't realise is that staying where you are takes a lot of energy. You know, someone wants to build a bypass through your village. You have to fight to get it stopped. The weather begins to change, you know, climate change, and the farmers have to adjust and find new ways of keeping it going. The government brings in a rule saying you'll get a subsidy if you cut down all your hedges, and so the farmers have to adjust to that, and so on and so forth. New people arrive in the village with new ideas and everything like that. Like we had people coming in and they had their houses, they thought, lovely house, but why have we got this hedge in front of it? So they take down the hedges, and then they discover that the cows on the common come and eat all their vegetables, their flowers. Yeah. So the keeping homeostasis, keeping things as they are, actually takes a lot of energy. And that comes from trying to sort of isolate things and give them causes, rather than taking this holistic view of a system thinking. And as he says, complex systems accounts require us to acknowledge that it will often be the case that systemic harms and injustices, like iatrogenic illness, occur without it needing to be the case that anyone intends to create harm or act unfairly. So it doesn't say there aren't these bad people, it just says you don't actually need them. It would go that way anyway. Now, what he's talking about is complex systems thinking. Some people seem to think that's something frightfully new. It's the latest advance in science and all that sort of thing. And I, in the book, Little Book of Demons, argued it's not so. This actually is an old way of thinking that humans are particularly good at. And the argument I made in Little Book of Demons is that seeing was in favour of discarnate intelligence. Now that is a sort of remark that puts the skeptics and the scientismists into giggles, because how can you possibly have a discarnate intelligence? Intelligence is something is in a brain, even if it's just the brain of a mouse or a moth. And I think, have they never heard of artificial intelligence? Have they no feeling the way that something like an ecological system actually has intelligence? It has evolved intelligence as it built up. Again, the stability of an ecological system is because it's working very hard. It's got all the internal processes which is keeping it stable. That's an achievement. So so how is it that humans are good at that? Because it relates to what I called simple magical thinking. And this I explained in the Little Book of Demons, and I gave the example of a newborn baby. A newborn baby begins not by mumbo-jumbo magical thinking. It begins by proto-science. It begins to learn that the world appears to be made up of solid objects and actions which can be repeated. Scientism. So it'll reach for the spoon and pick it up and put it down again. Reach for it, pick it up, put it down again. Spoon appears somewhere else, it'll reach up, pick it. It's learning that there are these solid objects which don't go away, and they are reliable. You know, they're always there, and you can move them around, you can do things. It's a material world it's learning about. And then comes the proto-science. It learns what is repeatable by making repeatable experiments. It'll take the spoon and go bang, 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 bang on the table, drive the parents mad, because it's learning that every time you do the same action with a solid object, you get the same result. And you can actually predict what's going to happen. So, for instance, pushes his toy truck to the edge of the table and it falls to the floor. And you'll begin to get explanations. Why does it fall to the floor? Because everything falls to the floor when you push it to the end of the table. Now, of course, I'm talking about pre-verbal understanding. So it's more a sort of, he's learning the senses of what happens. Then in the book I gave the example of a problem which is nearly predictable but not quite. And that is, when the spoon falls to the floor, mother comes and picks it up and puts it back. Is this another repeatable scientific result? No, because she isn't so clear to predict. Sometimes it's quite a long time before she comes and picks it up. Sometimes she gets a bit bolshy and refuses to pick it up, or she takes it away and washes it before she puts it back. So something is happening here, and this is the beginning of the understanding of complexity. And the breakthrough, and again we're pre-verbal, so I can only put it into words, is when the baby thinks, what if there's another me inside mother? Now, that doesn't mean I can predict what she's going to do exactly, but I can sort of understand. Because I can feel bolshy, I can feel lazy. I don't always do what's meant to be done straight away. So I got a sort of understanding now of why she behaves like that. Now again, this is pre-verbal. It's just a sort of, once you get the idea that sentience can live outside your own skull, it begins to open up your world with a lot of understanding. Maybe there's a mind in the dog. And that begins to make his behaviour much more understandable. Maybe there's a mind in the weather system. It looks pretty moody at times, things like that, and I begin to understand how to read it. When you grow up and you're a gardener, to think of a plant as a sort of a dead object, you just got to read the instructions. Oh yeah, bury it 3 inches deep, water twice a day, in semi-shade. Well, how semi is this bit of shade? I don't know. If instead you think of it as an alive thing, and it's maybe trying to communicate with you, you look at things like if the leaves are curling up, if they're going a funny colour, if it isn't growing very fast, it's giving you messages about whether it's happy or not. And that, you can become a better gardener for observing these things. And my favourite example, of course, is the market trader who looks at all those screens and says, wow, the markets are really nervous today. And he hasn't made a scientific statement which means he can predict exactly what's going to happen. But he's got an understanding that'll help him to make better decisions. So that was my argument. What is called systems thinking is actually the very basic magical thinking. To see the world as a place full of intelligence and spirits, and to recognize that some of those spirits are better behaved than others. And so I'm suggesting you can think of the medical profession, I should say the medical sector, so I include the pharmaceutical companies, as a spirit. And you can respect it because it is wanting to survive. But you can take it with a pinch of salt because you know that its survival doesn't necessarily coincide with human survival. It depends on curing people, otherwise it wouldn't exist. But it also knows that the best thing to do is to help people with remedies, but not cure them. And so, you see, what you're doing is you're sort of empathizing with the spirit of medicine, and you're getting a better understanding of how it works. And that doesn't say there aren't some evil people out there doing things, but it gives you a richer picture of what is actually going on. You can compare it with a virus. You see, when COVID came to our area, and then you began to get these variants appearing, Omicron and all that. Just like the experienced camper who looks out for the prevailing wind, experienced doctors like ours said, there will be variants, but they probably will be more infectious but less harmful. Now again, that's the way the wind blows of viruses. It doesn't prove anything, but it tells you what to look out for, gives you an understanding. Because sure enough, the later versions were more infectious, but they did a lot less harm, and I'm rather glad I got one of those later ones, Omicron. You see, from the virus's point of view, just as a patient cured is a customer lost, a human killed is a waste of resources. So the ideal thing, the epitome of a good virus is the common cold, because it's so mild that macho people will go to work saying, well, I'm not going to miss a day's work for a few sniffles. And they'll go to work and they'll sneeze and give everyone else the virus. So from a virus point of view, the common cold is the Jesus of viruses. All the other ones aspire to be like that. And so Omicron, as it evolves, will become more and more infectious, but probably less deadly. Again, it's a question of sort of, rather than trying to work out, it's fine, you go to the laboratory and do tests and things like that, but just as you can, when you're setting up your tent, you can measure the actual wind speed and so on and so on, and look at the weather forecast. But it's also good just to bear in mind the prevailing wind and the way it goes. Now, I'm going to apply that thinking to the question of populism. A populist party is one whose basic appeal is to a large number of disadvantaged people in society. Either people who really are disadvantaged or those you can persuade are disadvantaged. And there are plenty of those around because of that awful figure about, the top 5% of people, even in countries like America and that, owning, 80% of the entire wealth, that sort of thing. So there are a lot of people below par. Now, I'm going to take an example from South Africa, simply because politics in South Africa is a bit more in your face than it is in Britain. And so you'll give us a clearer example, and then we can compare it with other countries. The position in South Africa is a one-party state, really, the ANC. But the ANC is split almost down the middle. Two factions, both ANC. One faction is the RET faction, R-E-T. And they speak up for the poor people, the out-of-work people, the uneducated people of South Africa. And that is a very necessary and good thing to do, because there are a lot of those people in South Africa. The other party is under our President Ramaphosa, is looking at the world, looking at South Africa, frankly, from a sort of world capitalist point of view. What is needed is to increase investment in the country, establish the rule of law, a reliable police force, proper infrastructure, and that way you'll sort of lift the country up and help those poorer people. That's the theory, and it's a theory which is applied a lot around the world. But let's look at the first party, RET. They've actually been in power for, about 12 years now, I think. They came into power when Zuma was elected president, President Zuma, in about 29 or 10. Their aim was very worthy. It was to improve the lot of all South Africans, particularly by helping the poor and disenchanted people. And by concentrating particularly on education, providing services, and increasing employment. Now that's a very worthy thing to do. And of course, if they've had 10 years in power, and in a sense they are still in power because, as I say, they've still got half of the ANC, they should get really good results. So look at these employment figures. Up, up, up. The problem is, that is not the employment figures, that is the unemployment figures. More and more people are unemployed. More and more people are poorer. The difference between rich and poor has increased over those 10 to 12 years. And the services they're provided with are worse and worse. And then let me just read you something about South Africa spends 20% of its budget on education, or 6.4% of GDP, considerably more than many other emerging market economies, and yet performs dismally in international comparisons. They give the World Economic Forum Competitive Index, ranks South Africa's overall education system at 140 out of 144 countries. In particular, in an NSC one to study, only 11% pass maths with a mark of 40% or above. And there's a graph which I won't go into great detail showing that there's South Africa, and the red is the people who scored really badly in maths, and we're the winners. So here is the party, the populist party, who should really be helping to reduce unemployment, improve education, and yet its performance has been disastrous. So how could that happen? Well, the answer is, as far as I'm concerned, the equivalent of the paradox of the medical profession. If a party depends upon the vote of the suffering majority, the underdogs, the poor, the out of work, the uneducated, and the sick, then the one thing it cannot do is cure those conditions, because that would reduce the people voting for it. It would reduce their constituency. It's in the interest of such a party to increase the number of unemployed, poor, disenchanted people, and even to persuade some of those that are not that badly off that they are badly off. That's the way populism, that's the way the wind blows in populism, the way it tends to evolve. And it doesn't necessarily mean there are evil people wanting to make that happen. There's a lot of goodwill in the ANC. It's just that it doesn't work very well. Now, I've taken South Africa as an example because I don't know so much about other countries, or they're not around me. But if you take one of the paradoxes to me of, say, the George Bush No, the Bush administration, when they went to war in Iraq, that was a populist movement. It got a lot of votes from relatively downtrodden people in the middle of America. And the irony here was that there was a cry to go to war against Iraq from the very people whose children would be killed as soldiers. People from the areas there wasn't much employment, so they become soldiers, who are rather poor. They're the ones who'd be sent to war, whereas the rich educated people would get their jobs in universities and things like that. They wouldn't join the army. So there was the Republican Party at that time was, as it were, feeding off the lowest people in society at their own expense. Now, what is the mechanism here? Well, this applies, I think, to a lot of populist parties. Populism gets a lot of strength from anger. If people are badly off and downtrodden, they very justifiably feel angry. And it's things like anger that make people vote more for a warlike government, or to go to war as an expression of anger. So again, we're not talking of a neat mechanism that you can exactly switch on and off. We're talking about a prevailing wind towards populist parties feeding off anger. And you could probably say something, I mean, we think of the Russian Revolution, very much supported by the downtrodden peasants who suffer under the landowners. Did they have a great time afterwards? No, because the state took over their land, and they now didn't have land that they used to have. So, you know, it's Brexit in England. To what extent has it actually met the dreams of those people who voted for it? Now, I'd say not very much. So that, you see, is this, what I call the paradox of populism. It offers something which it needs not to deliver if it's going to survive. And the voting, you know, in the ANC is just about 50-50. So getting those figures up is very important. Now, when I talked about these things, about conspiracies, one of the comments was made, yes, but there can still be people behind it. I'm not arguing with that. I'm not saying there are no people behind these conspiracies. I'm just saying, don't forget to look where the wind is blowing. And that might explain a lot. Now, if we look at that example of RET versus the Ramaphosa, the president, it's true, the criticism of Ramaphosa, yes, he's trying to sort of impose Western capitalist thinking on the country and all that type of thing, and he is. The people he's appealing to are mostly people in towns who have jobs and are educated. That's their appeal. And so all the moves he's making are towards building those jobs, helping the economy and everything. He sounds very worthy, doesn't it? But he's actually just doing the same thing as RET. He's increasing his constituency by doing that, just as they're increasing their constituency by putting people out of work. So I've explained that it doesn't mean that the RET people are evil necessarily. So are there no conspirators? Well, I'll give you an example where there is an element of conspiracy. RET sells itself as the voice of the people, not this capitalist nonsense kind of thing. Well, let me tell you what does RET stand for? It stands for Radical Economic Transformation. That's 11 syllables in just 3 words. Does that sound like the voice of the people? One of their other catchphrases is white monopoly capital, another multi-word. So where did that come from? Well, the answer is that it comes from London. When people were beginning to get disenchanted with the what's now called the RET movement, because they were noticing that they weren't getting better education, they began to get fed up with it. And so what that party did was hire the services of a British promotional agency, a highly respected one, Bell Pottinger in London. And it was Bell Pottinger that invented this terminology, told them wrote the speeches for them, told them the terms to use, talk about white monopoly capitalism. Because Bell Pottinger did what any good agency would do, he thought, where's the energy we can put behind this fading party? The energy is anger. Now, it was difficult to stir up anger in South Africa because we'd had the revolution of Mandela, saying, whereas before there'd been this black versus white, the Nationalist Party, apartheid, saying we're actually a rainbow nation. There's so many colours in between. There's black people marrying white people, having children. There's Indian people, there's Malaysian people, there's Chinese. There are all these colours, and we're one nation. So there was a lot of goodwill there. But it was only about 20 years old, because there was that memory still of the past. And what Bell Pottinger did was to say, let's bring back that memory. Let's bring back the thinking of apartheid. Black, white, privilege, not privilege. Let's bring that back with these phrases and use that energy to build a party. So that was a sort of conspiracy. And the interesting thing is, in Britain, Bell Pottinger got such a bad reputation for doing that the company had to be closed down. There were talks about it in Parliament or whatever, and they got sacked from the sort of Institute of Public Relations or whatever it was. And the company folded. But what it had set going lives on in South Africa. So there's an element of conspiracy there, but it's also the way the wind blows. And this is another example I gave in past things and in this book. You see, again, a thought experiment. I said the ANC began with a lot of very intelligent, well-educated people. Many of them educated themselves, and that was a famous thing that happened in Robben Island. They got together with Mandela and other people, and they educated themselves. And so they're intelligent, educated people with a strong vision of what they wanted to do. Now, of course, the trouble is, as soon as they got into power, many more people joined because they wanted the power that they've got. So you also get people who are actually more interested in power than in the original intentions of the ANC. So I ask you, as with my early example, to imagine, I'm going to call them two parishes. I don't know what the proper word for it. One of them, both run by the ANC. Parish A has got those very competent, visionary ANC people running it. Parish B has got people who are only in it for the money and the power, but they're ANC people. Now, they're both given equal amounts of money for education, for health, for improving the infrastructure, for creating work. And Parish A spends that money to do just that. It spends money towards better schools, it spends money towards improving the roads, it spends money towards stimulating business and building hospitals, things like that. And everyone benefits. They become more educated, better off, healthier, and their vision expands. Parish B is given the same amount of money for education, but they spend it on fast cars and big houses, things like that, and similarly with all the other money. So things remain as they were. People just as uneducated, just as poor, just as people out of work. Now, it might seem very obvious who should get the sack, but if you go back to headquarters and just look at the voting results next time there's an election, Parish B voting for the ANC stays high. Why? Because they don't know any better. They haven't, they've never heard of any other party. They're uneducated, they can't read, and they're so poor that the ANC can buy them with a gift of a t-shirt and a tin of beans because they're so hungry. They buy their vote. So the ANC will do very well in that parish. The trouble with Parish A is that when you educate people and give them a choice, the problem is they might actually make a choice. And of course the cynics will say, oh, they've become bourgeois, that's it, oh, so they'll vote for other parties because they're smug and content. I think it's much simpler than that. If you read the papers, you just discover there are other alternatives, there are other parties. And you might think, well, let's give it a go. So it's nothing dramatic. It's just that the vote for the ANC begins to drop a bit under there. So people back at headquarters will say, those people in Parish B, they're loyal comrades, they are. We must promote them, put them up in the government. Whereas those people at A, God, what a lot of useless laggards. The votes drop there. We'll demote them, chuck them out, replace them with decent people like we got in Prevailing B. And so, again, that prevailing wind blows towards more incompetent, more greedy thing. And it's just part of the system. And add that to a bit of conspiracy like Bell Pottinger, and you have a recipe for corruption. You have a recipe for a country being ground down by a populist movement. Now, this, as I said, what I call magical thinking, we call it systems thinking. It's thinking of the spirit behind things and empathetically engaging with that spirit and say, what does it really want? Can be very helpful, not for explaining, but for giving an understanding of the way things go. And that very understanding is helpful in itself, and it might help towards finding solutions, or at least not wasting so much time trying to find who's behind this evil thing that's going on. The wasted time, that is. You can still see if there really are people. And sometimes that sort of thinking might lead to some solutions, even if they're only partial ones. For instance, I think of ancient Chinese philosophy is more like systems thinking. It's more like seeing the spirit behind things, all that. And how did they address that paradox of healthcare, that a patient cured is a customer lost? Well, I'm told the traditional Chinese health system was that you paid your doctor all the time while you were well, but you stopped paying when you were ill. Doesn't that make a different picture? You see, when you're ill, that's the very time when you're not earning and where you need the medicine. And that system, I think, is very neat. That would really change the way the wind blows, wouldn't it? And that was the system was adopted, for instance, in Britain in the 50s with the National Health Service. Everyone pays a bit towards their health all the time, unless they're ill. Then they don't pay, instead they get free treatment. That is such a neat solution. Surely it's the answer. Surely everyone would do that now. But of course it isn't that simple, because that spirit, the national health spirit, is just one of many spirits jostling for position. And it's up against that other spirit of commercial medicine, which is pushing the other way. And so that National Health Service, which really was pretty miraculous, and Britain was very proud of it, it was a fine feature of Britain in the 50s and 60s, was under constant attack, particularly from the Conservative Party, which knew there'd be a hell of a lot of money could be made if they could sell it off to the American pharmaceutical companies and break that monopoly. And so, it's a lovely solution, and it's probably a valuable contribution to a better health service, but don't expect it to rise out on top like the company that actually cures people, because it's up against a lot of winds blowing in the other direction. So that really was what I wanted to say, and it's made up of these previous ideas I've talked about, but putting them together a bit different and maybe give a different spin. So this, one other thing I would say is that it gives, I also put this in the book, it helps towards this idea of what do we do in a post-truth world. You do the same thing. You empathize with the thing that's speaking to you, whether it's a party or a product or whatever. And rather than putting all your energy into saying, is it true what it's saying? And in a post-truth world, how can you tell what's true? You might read it in the reliable newspaper, but is there no bias there? You can't be absolutely sure. So you can spend a hell of a lot of effort trying to unearth the truth. And I would say use a bit of that effort, not to go searching in libraries and on internet and everything to try and find what's true, but use just a bit of that effort to empathize with the thing that's speaking with you as a spirit and say, why is it saying that? Why is it saying these words? And you can get an insight and understanding of what's going on, which, like the blowing of the wind, it doesn't answer everything. It doesn't explain things. It doesn't give you exact solutions and predictions, but warns you to look out for a certain sort of, it's going to evolve in a certain way. So that's really what I wanted to talk about. And I'm sorry I had to repeat myself so much, but perhaps it was good to hear it from a different angle.